Years ago, I worked a night shift at a gas station out in the backwoods of Tennessee. It wasn't a busy place, actually. It was kind of a ghost town. The gas station sat on an old highway that used to be bustling until they built a new freeway. After that, every business on the road packed up and left, abandoning their buildings to rot. The only things left on that stretch of road were the gas station and a bunch of empty buildings that the local drogies started squatting in. The whole area had this eerie, forgotten feel to it. I was 18 at the time, working the 8 p.m. to midnight shift. It was usually dead quiet, and I was alone, which was fine most nights. I liked being able to listen to music, watch videos, or do whatever I wanted as long as I kept the place running. But something about that night felt different. There wasn't a soul in sight, no cars driving by, nothing but the hum of the lights above me and the occasional wind rattling the windows. It was around 11 p.m. and I had an hour left. I figured I should stop slacking off and actually get some work done. We were almost out of BP chips, so I had to grab more from the storage basement. I hated going down there. The basement was a dim, musty place that always gave me the creeps. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that messes with your head. But I didn't have much of a choice. I grabbed the keys and headed for the basement door. I got about halfway down the stairs when I heard something fall across the room, like a box being knocked over. Then there were footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming my way. I froze. My heart was pounding, but I managed to snap out of it and sprinted back up the stairs. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, panting and trying to collect myself. I had never felt a rush of fear like that before. I headed straight to the security monitor behind the counter to check the basement camera, and when the screen flickered on, my blood ran cold. There was a man standing in the middle of the basement, staring directly into the camera. He wasn't moving, just standing there with this twisted grin on his face. He didn't look like the usual junkies we got around here. He was clean, shaven, wearing a pair of jeans and a button-up shirt. The worst part was his eyes. There was this crazed, manic look in them, like he knew something I didn't. His grin never faltered, and he just stared right at me. I called my boss immediately. It was late, and he was pissed at first. But when he heard the panic in my voice, he changed his tone real quick. He told me he'd be there in 15 minutes, but in the meantime, he said to lock the front door and make sure the guy didn't leave the basement. I asked if I should call the cops, but for some reason, he told me not to. Not yet. That struck me as odd, but I did what he said. I locked the front door and went back to the monitor. The man was still standing there, smiling. 3 minutes passed. Then, without breaking eye contact with the camera, he turned and walked out of view. I couldn't see him anymore, and that made it worse. I didn't know where he was. Was he still in the basement? Or worse, had he found another way out? When my boss finally arrived, he wasn't taking any chances. He had a shotgun in hand and stormed straight to the basement. I followed him, feeling safer with him around, but still terrified of what we might find. We opened the basement door, flipped the lights on, and walked down. But when we got there, the basement was empty, completely empty. There wasn't a single trace of anyone being there. My boss looked at me and shook his head. He said I was probably tired and seeing things, but I knew what I saw. That man was real, and that smile, I could still see it in my head. That was the last night I worked at that gas station alone. I used to work the night shift at a small gas station just off a remote highway. Most nights were uneventful, an occasional trucker or a random traveler passing through. Then, one night a man came in who looked like he had been through hell, mid-40s, unshaven, dirt-streaked clothes and dark circles under his eyes. He bought a pack of cigarettes paid entirely in change and left without a word. He came in every night after that at exactly 2 a.m., always buying the same thing, cigarettes and an energy drink. He barely spoke, just gave a grunt or a nod when I handed him his stuff. I thought he might have been a local, maybe someone who worked late, or someone going through tough times. It wasn't my place to ask, so I left him alone. After a couple of weeks, I finally decided to ask for his name. I figured we saw each other enough that it wouldn't be weird. When he came in that night, I casually asked so. "What's your name, man?" He looked up at me, eyes bloodshot and intense, and said, "You can call me Mike." His voice was raspy, like gravel in his throat. Things started to feel off after that. Mike would still come in at the same time every night, but instead of leaving, he'd linger around the store. Sometimes he'd just stand in the corner, staring at the shelves, but not really looking at anything. One night, he stood in the chip aisle for over an hour without saying a word. I asked if he needed anything, and he just smiled, a strange, unsettling grin, then left without buying anything. Then, one night, it was pouring rain and the store was empty. I was stocking shelves when I noticed him outside just standing under the flickering gas station lights. He wasn't moving, just staring at the entrance like he was deciding whether to come in or not. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked in. But something was different. He was soaked to the bone, his long, greasy hair clinging to his face, and his eyes were wide, almost manic. He didn't go to the counter like usual. He stood in the middle of the store, dripping wet, and just stared at me. "Mike, are you all right?" I asked, trying to keep calm. He didn't respond, just stood there, water pooling at his feet. After a moment, he turned and walked toward the restroom in the back. I heard the door close behind him. Minutes passed, then half an hour, and still, he hadn't come out. I started to get a bad feeling. I walked back to check on him, and the restroom door was wide open, but Mike wasn't there. The restroom was completely empty. I checked the security footage later that night. I watched as Mike walked in, stared at me, and walked to the restroom, but I never saw him leave. After that, I never saw him again. A week later, I mentioned Mike to a regular customer who lived nearby. He told me something that made my skin crawl. Mike's house had been abandoned for years. The last person who lived there had gone missing after being evicted. No one had seen or heard from him since. I used to work at a 24-hour gas station on a stretch of highway outside of town. Most nights, it was pretty uneventful people coming in for gas or snacks, truckers stopping by for a break. But one night, something strange happened around 1 a.m. A car pulled up to the pump. It was an older model, looked a little beat up. The driver stepped out. He looked rough. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He walked in, his eyes darting around the store like he was on edge. He grabbed a pack of gum, came up to the counter, and as I was ringing him up, he asked, "Hey, can I ask you something?" I nodded, and that's when he said, "I think there's someone in my back seat." At first, I thought he was joking or messing with me, but the look on his face told me he was serious. I glanced out at his car, and the windows were too tinted to see inside, so I couldn't tell if anyone was in there or not. I asked him what he meant. He explained that a few hours earlier, he had picked up a hitchhiker on the highway. The guy had asked for a ride and said he was heading in the same direction. At first, everything seemed normal. The guy was quiet, didn't say much, but after about an hour, he realized something weird. The hitchhiker hadn't moved at all. He didn't shift in his seat, didn't say a word, just sat there, completely still. The driver said he'd been getting more and more uneasy as the miles went by, and when they finally pulled into the gas station, he looked in the rearview mirror, and the guy still hadn't moved. He couldn't even see the guy's face, just the hood of a jacket covering his head. I told him maybe the hitchhiker had fallen asleep, but he shook his head. "No, you don't get it. It's been hours. He hasn't moved a muscle." I didn't know what to say. I mean, what could I say? I suggested he check on the guy, make sure he was okay. Reluctantly, he agreed. He walked back out to his car, but he was hesitant. He opened the back door slowly, and that's when I got a glimpse of the hitchhiker. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The person was slumped over head down, completely still. But there was something wrong. The arms too long, unnaturally long. The legs bent at strange angles like they didn't fit the way a normal person should. The driver suddenly let out a scream, slammed the door shut, and bolted back inside. His face was pale, and he was shaking uncontrollably. He kept saying, "That's not a person. That's not a person." I asked him what he meant, but he was too freaked out to answer clearly. He just kept repeating, "It's not human." At that point, my heart was racing too. But against my better judgment, I decided to go outside and take a look myself. The guy's car was just out of range of the security cameras. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped up to the rear window, peeking inside. Suddenly, I felt a sharp grip around my neck. Someone yanked me back hard, and before I could react, I was thrown to the ground. Two men, one masked, the other holding what looked like a knife, stood over me. "Don't make a sound," the masked one hissed. I realized this wasn't about some creepy hitchhiker. These guys had set me up. They dragged me back towards the store, clearly planning to rob the place. My heart pounded as I felt for my smartwatch, trying to press the emergency call button. I managed to dial the station owner, whispering for help as they shoved me inside. Just as one of the robbers began rifling through the cash register, headlights blazed into the store. The owner's truck screeched to a halt outside, and before the robbers could react, the owner burst through the door, shotgun in hand. "Get the hell out to here," he shouted, firing a warning shot into the ceiling. The robbers panicked, bolting out the door and disappearing into the night. I was still on the floor, trying to catch my breath. Later that night, the police tracked the guys down. Turns out they had been hitting up gas stations along the highway for weeks. As for the hitchhiker, well, let's just say that part of the story wasn't as real as the danger that almost got me killed. If stories like this keep you on edge, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with those who love a good scare. Your support helps spread the chills far and wide.